The Vietnam War stands out as one of the most brutal conflicts that claimed numerous lives over 2 decades of relentless fighting. It was a time of unimaginable horror where the beauty of an Asian nation was scarred by bloodshed and suffering. But what were the truly terrifying aspects of this great war? Well, get ready to be gripped with fear as this video unveils the harrowing scenes that unfolded during the Vietnamese War 60 years ago. Ghosts of the Jungle. Now, I want you to picture yourself as a soldier wandering through the cold and dark forests. Every step you take feels like a roll of the dice, uncertain if you'll make it through. And then in your head, you hear these eerie, spine-chilling cries of people in agony. I know, it might sound like a scene from a horror movie, but believe it or not, this was actually a real experience. You see, the U.S. Army orchestrated Operation Wandering Soul during the Vietnam War, a tactic that exploited the beliefs of the Southern Vietnamese who held strong convictions about the wandering spirits of Ma Quay. In Vietnam, it's believed that when someone passes away, their soul lingers, especially if they didn't receive proper burial rites or if their death was unjust or untimely. These restless spirits haunted those who neglected to honor their memory. The U.S. capitalized on this belief by creating fake audio tapes. They recorded the anguished cries of people interspersed with horrifying phrases like, "I have come back to let you know I am dead. It is hell. I'm in hell. Don't end up like me. Go home before it's too late." They even incorporated recordings of tigers and other wild animals just to heighten the terror. These spine-tingling audio tapes were then broadcasted from loudspeakers attached to helicopters, meant to torment North Vietnamese soldiers. The initial shock caused ghost-induced illnesses among the Vietnamese, but in the end, this strategy proved futile. Guerrilla warfare. You see, the Viet Cong, they were quite the cunning bunch. These were local insurgents, basically the foot soldiers for the North Vietnamese, who, as luck would have it, were the sworn enemies of the folks down south. Their playbook was guerrilla warfare, a sneaky strategy for taking on armed groups, especially the military. They had a knack for hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, ambushes, and good old sabotage to get the upper hand. What made them truly chilling, though, was how they blended in with the regular folks. No uniforms in sight. It was a real mind game, because you never knew who was friend or foe. Some well-meaning souls even extended their hospitality to these insurgents, not realizing the danger. It kept the Americans on edge, never quite sure who was on their side. The guerrillas, they were masters at instilling fear and causing chaos. They'd even orchestrate friendly fire, making the enemy fight amongst themselves, thinking the guerrillas were just innocent bystanders. Crafty move by the Northerners, don't you think? Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was a code name that the Americans used for their bombing campaigns during the war. It also marked the first assault imposed on the Northern Vietnamese by the government of South Vietnam. This operation took place during 1965 to 1968. The American Army used this operation to destroy the communists by throwing dangerous chemicals and bombs into their villages. President Lyndon Johnson also approved bombing raids on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a pathway that connected both South and North Vietnam. He aimed to stop the flow of assistance from the Northern Vietnamese to the Viet Cong armies. North Vietnamese also got aid from China and other Soviet Union countries by which they were able to construct an air defense system. All this back-and-forth bombing had a chilling toll. More than 30,000 civilians met their end. They say the Americans wiped out 85% of North Vietnam's oil capacity and 70% of their ammo stash. North Vietnam, well, it slowly withered away, both in terms of people and resources. Tet Offensive. You may be familiar with the Vietnamese Tet holidays. The period is known for taking breaks from the usual working schedule to spend time with families, but not in '68. Nope, the Northern Vietnamese had something chilling up their sleeves for the Tet Offensive, right smack during their New Year's bash. Talk about a sinister way to kick off the year. So, the Tet Offensive was the first solid attack against the Southern Vietnamese and the United States. The North launched it on January 30th, 1968. This was one of the most extensive operations that caused conflicts during the war. It was a significant defeat for the Southern Vietnamese, as most of them were on holiday and were caught off guard when the attack started. Ho Chi Minh led this approach with the hope of achieving victory over the U.S. as they underestimated the power of the North Vietnamese. They attacked over 100 cities in South Vietnam, including Hue and Saigon. This also contributed to the loss of the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. It also changed the public perception of the Vietnam War as people began to question the outcome of the war. A famous American journalist, Walter Cronkite, declared that the war could not be won. The U.S. and South Vietnamese tried to repel their enemies, but it was a great victory for the North. This offensive marked the beginning of the end of the war. Tunnel warfare. US soldiers really got a taste of what it was like to face off against the Northern Vietnamese regular army. You see, the Viet Cong's army was something else. They were known as hidden enemies because they were expert tunnel builders. They dug thousands of tunnels all around Saigon and other parts of the country. These folks knew every nook and cranny like the back of their hand. It was pretty impressive, albeit a bit crazy. Now, these tunnels weren't just for show. The Viet Cong used them to hide from the American army. Inside those tunnels, they had space to plan, train, and hide from their enemies. They even had underground barracks, hospitals, kitchens, and storage rooms. Life down there was tough though. Imagine barely enough air to breathe and hardly being able to tilt your head, not to mention the creepy crawlies like rats, snakes, and centipedes they encountered. Yikes! Exploring these dark and dangerous tunnels was a frightening task for soldiers during the war. Despite the terrifying conditions, there was still a glimmer of hope for those who ventured inside. Tiger cages. I know, you are probably thinking that the US soldiers released tigers from their cages since the ghost of the jungle approach failed. Well, that would have been more clever of them, but they devised a more vicious plan. The US allies used these tiger cages to trap their enemies instead. Again, this was another intelligent strategy. These cages were used to trap the Viet Cong and many other citizens who looked suspicious. They squeezed as many people as possible into a cell until enough space was left for poisonous gas. Both the innocent and the guilty were filled in these cages, although many civilians escaped this operation. The cages were made of small concrete ditches with heavy bars on top. Being in them was incredibly uncomfortable and painful. Many people died because there wasn't enough air to breathe, and those who survived often had severe bruises and injuries. Prisoners who complained were sometimes treated even worse. They had quicklime thrown on them, which caused painful burns on their skin that were never treated. This was a grim chapter in history, where the very people of the land were treated as outsiders in their homeland, their pain and suffering beyond measure. Agent Orange. You might have initially thought these were food aid packages sent to help hungry people, but sadly, they were actually dangerous chemicals that caused the deaths of many. These chemicals, called herbicides, were used to clear plants, but the Americans used them as weapons in the north. They hurt anyone exposed to them, destroyed villages, and left lasting scars on civilians and the military. Even the American military wasn't immune to the consequences. Years after the war's end, the toll was staggering. 2 million Vietnamese lives lost, 3 million wounded, and 12 million forced into a life of exile. A heartbreaking legacy of over 150,000 post-war children afflicted by debilitating birth disorders. These herbicides unleashed a wave of afflictions, from cancer to congenital disorders, casting a long dark shadow that still lingers today. Though this highly hazardous herbicide, known as dioxin contaminant, is no longer in use, its legacy lives on. So even as you pick up those innocent-looking oranges at the grocery store, remember the haunting truth that sometimes the most seemingly harmless things can carry hidden dangers. Children of the dust. These children were referred to as Americasians. They were products of US soldiers who had affairs with Vietnamese women. These children were said to be symbols of fraternizing with the enemy. They lived a hard life as they were regarded as children born out of wedlock. 5 years later, after the US Army began to evacuate the country, the government attempted to extricate these unfortunate children. Operation Baby Lift began. This operation was made to evacuate over 3,000 orphans from the country. On April 4, 1975, the first cargo plane took off from Saigon with 314 people, which was mainly filled with children. This was a devastating scenario as the aircraft crashed a few minutes into the flight. This operation had more up its sleeves. It wasn't a plan to evacuate the children from Vietnam, it was in essence a chilling plan to evacuate these young lives from existence itself. Post-war trauma. With the fear of death and uncertainty of what is yet to come, you could imagine the state of these victims' mental health. Survivors of the war suffered several mental illnesses, including anxiety and depression. Many lost their loved ones and other valuables during this devastating period. Over 18.7% of the survivors were said to have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The survivors became victims of depression and suicide. Some eventually became alcohol and drug addicts, which led to mental derangement. Others were said to have lost their eyesight and other body parts due to tear gas, bombs, and other newly improved technologies and weapons used during the war. Many also died of sepsis, as no medical personnel could prevent their wounds from being invaded by microorganisms. The horrors of war are profound, and one can only wonder about the unimaginable consequences had nuclear weapons entered the fray. Yet, history has shown that the painful lessons of war's toll on mental health are too easily forgotten. Wars are dreadful in many ways, and the Vietnam War was no exception. Its horrors spared no one, from the youngest to the oldest, civilians to soldiers, families torn asunder, innocent children left orphaned, and countless souls forced to flee their homeland as refugees. Well, which of these gruesome stories disturbed you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you hunger for more bone-chilling tales and gripping content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We've got a lot of unsettling stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, thanks for watching.